Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the rise of Europe.
Ooh, a classic.
It really is. And we've got a fantastic paper to guide us today. It's called The Rise of Europe, Atlantic Trade, Institutional Change, and Economic Growth.
That's a mouthful. But a good one. Really gets to the heart of the matter.
It does. And one of the things that really struck me is how this paper reframes the whole narrative.
Right. It's not just about Europe as a single entity rising up. There's more nuance to it.
Totally. Like, one of the first things they point out is that it's more accurate to talk about the rise of Atlantic Europe.
Makes sense, right? I mean, geography plays a huge role.
Absolutely. The paper shows how those European nations with direct access to the Atlantic, especially the ones heavily involved in colonialism and that whole transatlantic trade system.
Yeah, I think Britain, the Netherlands, those guys.
Exactly. They saw way higher economic growth than the landlocked countries.
It's like they were tapping into a whole new world of possibilities.
Literally a new world.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Oh, there's a twist.
Always. The paper argues that this growth wasn't just about the profits from trade.
Huh, interesting.
It was about how that trade sparked deeper changes, like institutional changes.
Oh, I see where they're going with this. So it's about how the whole system shifts, not just more money coming in.
Exactly.
Right.
Think about it. You have this new class of merchants suddenly flush with cash from their Atlantic ventures.
And they're thinking, hey, we're the ones driving this growth. We deserve a say in how things are run.
Right. They start demanding changes. They want their property rights protected. They want to limit the power of monarchs.
So they're not just passively accepting the status quo.
Not at all. And sometimes they were really successful in pushing for those changes. Take Britain, for instance.
Ah, yes, good old England.
The paper highlights the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution.
Those were pivotal moments.
They were, and these merchants played a key role in those upheavals.
It wasn't just about political power struggles, was it?
Nope. These were moments of profound institutional transformation.
Like rewriting the rules of the game.
Exactly. You see the emergence of Parliament, which gains more influence and starts to put checks on the monarchy.
And that has huge implications for the entire economy.
Right. It's creating a more predictable, stable environment where businesses can thrive.
Like laying the groundwork for centuries of economic growth.
It's incredible how much impact those changes had, and the paper brings up another fascinating example. The Netherlands.
The Dutch. Always a good story there.
Remember their revolt against the Habsburgs?
Oh yeah, fighting for their independence.
And who was at the forefront of that struggle? You guessed it, merchants. They were pushing for more economic freedom.
It's amazing how they were willing to put everything on the line for their beliefs.
They were. And they won. The Dutch revolt ushered in an era where merchants held real political power.
No coincidence that this was also their golden age, right? A time of incredible economic and cultural flourishing.
It's like a textbook example of how this dynamic between trade and institutional change can lead to something truly remarkable.
So we've got Britain, the Netherlands, both showing us how this can work.
But the paper also looks at what happens when things go differently, like with Spain and Portugal.
Ah, right. They were major players in the Atlantic world, too.
Huge players. But they clung to a more traditional model of power. The monarchies held on tight to control.
So even though they were getting rich from their colonies, their institutions didn't really adapt.
Yeah, it's like they were missing a crucial ingredient for long-term success.
The paper suggests that this rigidity ultimately limited their economic progress.
It's such a stark contrast. It's like a natural experiment in history, showing us two different paths.
Two very different approaches to economic and political power.
And the results speak for themselves. It's fascinating to see how these different paths played out.
It is. And there's another case that the paper explores that I think you'll find interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
The Italian city-states.
Oh, yeah. They were economic powerhouses back in the day, weren't they?
They were, but they didn't have easy access to the Atlantic, did they?
That's true. They were more focused on the Mediterranean.
And while they had this incredible history of trade and innovation, they didn't experience the same kind of institutional shifts that we see in the Atlantic powers.
So even though they were starting from a strong position, they kind of got left behind in this new era of Atlantic-driven growth.
Exactly. It really highlights how important both geography and institutions were in this whole process.
I'm starting to see a bigger picture here. It wasn't just about ships and trade routes. It was about how these different factors interacted to shape the destiny of nations.
Absolutely. And I think what makes this paper so compelling is that it's not just telling a historical story. It's giving us a framework for understanding how economic opportunity and institutional change work together.
That's what makes it so relevant, even centuries later. We're not just looking back at the past, we're gaining insights into the forces that are shaping our world today. And I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to unpack here.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive. You hit the nail on the head. There's so much more to dig into. And one of the key concepts the paper explores is this idea of constraint on the executive.
Okay, constraint on the executive. Let's break that down a bit. We've been talking about this back and forth between monarchs and merchants.
Yeah.
So is this essentially about how much power a king or queen actually had?
Exactly. It's all about limits on their authority. How much they could just do whatever they wanted versus having to answer to other forces.
So like checks and balances.
Exactly. And the paper argues that this level of constraint was crucial in how a nation responded to all those opportunities from Atlantic trade. They actually went through and measured this constraint, developed a whole coding system to quantify it.
Wow, that's serious scholarship. They weren't just speculating, they were crunching the numbers.
Right. They looked at things like what formal rights did urban merchants have? Did they have any real protection in disputes with the nobility? Did they have any meaningful representation in parliament or similar bodies?
So they were getting down into the nitty-gritty details of how these institutions actually functioned.
They were. And what they found is super interesting. There's this clear connection between the rise of Atlantic trade, these institutional changes, and then ultimately economic growth. The countries that were more open to Atlantic trade, especially those with weaker monarchies and stronger protections for merchants, well, they just took off after 1500.
Makes sense. It's like they had the right systems in place to ride that wave of Atlantic trade.
It's like they were set up to be more flexible, more adaptable.
Yeah, the system itself could evolve along with the changing economic landscape. But wait, the paper doesn't just stop there, does it?
Oh, no, they keep digging. They want to know, why did some countries have these institutional advantages in the first place? What were the roots of this divergence?
So now we're going even deeper, back into the historical backstory.
We are. And they find some really intriguing patterns. For example, they point out that Britain, even before 1500, had already made some significant moves towards limiting the monarchy's power. Things like the Magna Carta.
Ah, that's right. It's like those earlier historical developments set the stage for a more constrained executive later on.
Precisely. It wasn't just some overnight transformation. It was this gradual process of institutional development, a series of events that, in hindsight, put them in a prime position to benefit from the Atlantic world.
Fascinating how these historical threads connect, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what about Spain and Portugal? We were just talking about them. They had a very different trajectory.
Very different. Remember, they had those more absolutist monarchies. The crown had a much tighter grip on economic activity.
So even though they were bringing in all this wealth from their colonies, their institutions weren't really keeping pace.
And the paper makes a strong argument that this institutional rigidity may have actually hurt them in the long run. They were extracting wealth, but they weren't creating the same kind of dynamic, innovative environment that you see in places like Britain and the Netherlands.
It's the difference between short-term gain and long-term sustainability.
A perfect way to put it. And then you have the Italian city-states, which offer yet another interesting comparison.
Right. They had that incredible history of trade and innovation, but they lacked that easy access to the Atlantic.
And their political systems, while often more Republican in nature, didn't really evolve in the same way as the Atlantic powers.
It's like they were facing a whole different set of challenges and opportunities.
They were, and while they remained relatively prosperous, they couldn't keep up with the growth of those Atlantic-focused nations.
It's a reminder that what works in one era might not work in another. You have to be able to adapt to the changing circumstances.
Absolutely. And this really highlights the complexity of this whole period. It's not some simple story of trade equals economic growth. There are so many other factors at play. Institutions, geography, historical accidents, maybe even just plain luck.
It's messy. It's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Exactly. And this leads us to another important point that the paper addresses. There's this tendency to think, oh, trade, that's the engine of everything. More trade equals more wealth equals a stronger economy. But the authors push back against that.
Oh, interesting. So they're saying it's not just about the volume of trade.
They are. They argue that while Atlantic trade definitely brought wealth to European nations, its overall impact on economic growth might have been more modest than we often assume.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So if it wasn't just about the sheer amount of trade, what else was going on? What was the missing piece?
Well, the paper points to the institutional changes that were triggered by Atlantic trade. That's where the real magic happens. Specifically, they highlight things like the strengthening of property rights and the emergence of more competitive markets.
It's like trade provided the spark, but it needed the right institutional fuel to really catch fire.
Brilliant analogy. That's the heart of their argument. Trade matters, but its impact depends on the institutional context.
It's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but no recipe.
Exactly. You need the right instructions, the right framework, to turn those ingredients into something amazing. And that brings us to the core of the paper's argument. The rise of Europe wasn't just a story of trade. It was this massive social transformation driven by the interplay of economic opportunity and institutional evolution.
It's a reminder that economic success isn't just about resources or technology. It's about creating the right environment where those things can flourish.
Absolutely. And that raises a really thought-provoking question that the paper hints at. If the rise of Europe was so closely linked to colonialism and the exploitation of resources from other parts of the world, what does that tell us about the nature of economic development?
That's a huge question, and one that we definitely need to grapple with as we continue to explore this period. But before we go too deep into that, let's maybe take a step back and look at some specific examples of how these institutional differences played out in practice. How did these systems actually function on the ground? Okay, let's get down to brass tacks here. How did these big ideas about institutions actually play out in real life? What kind of concrete examples did the paper give?
Oh, they had some really juicy case studies. Like take Spain, for example. Their whole system of royal monopolies meant that the crown had total control over trade with the colonies.
So it was all about who you knew, who you were connected to.
Exactly. The Casa de Contratación in Seville, that was the hub for everything. It basically shut down competition and stifled any kind of innovation.
This sounds like a recipe for stagnation, really.
It kind of was. Now,
Yeah.
compare that to Britain. They fostered a much more open and competitive environment. You had this vibrant merchant class, and they could pretty much jump into trading activities whenever they wanted.
And wasn't there something about the navigation acts?
Oh, yeah. Those were designed to protect British shipping interests, but in a way, they actually ended up boosting the growth of their merchant fleet and expanding their trading networks.
So even though there were regulations, they were actually promoting growth in a way.
That's the idea. It wasn't a completely free market, but it was way more dynamic than what you saw in Spain. And then there's the whole issue of taxation.
Oh yeah, taxes. Always a fun topic.
Right. So Spain, with all their wars and fancy royal court, they had to tax their people heavily.
Not exactly a sustainable strategy, is it?
Not really. It ended up hurting their economy in the long run. It's tough to encourage investment and entrepreneurship when you're squeezing everyone dry.
It's like killing the goose that lays the golden egg.
Exactly. Now, Britain, with its more limited monarchy, well, the crown couldn't just raise taxes whenever they felt like it. They had to work with Parliament, which represented a wider range of interests, including those of the merchants.
So it was more of a balanced system, more checks and balances.
Right. And that had a huge impact on their long-term economic trajectories. While Spain struggled under all those extractive institutions, Britain was flourishing under a system that encouraged innovation and investment.
It's amazing how these institutional differences played out, isn't it? It really shows how seemingly small things can have massive consequences.
It's like a ripple effect.
Hmm.
But what about those Italian city-states? We haven't talked about them in a while. It seems like their story was a bit different from both Britain and Spain.
Yeah, they were kind of in their own category, weren't they?
They were. They had this amazing history of trade and finance, but they just didn't have that access to the Atlantic. And their political systems, while often more Republican, they didn't change in the same way as those in Britain or the Netherlands.
So they missed out on both the geographical advantages and the institutional transformations that really propelled the rise of those Atlantic powers.
It's like they were playing a different game entirely. And while they did all right for themselves, they just couldn't keep up with the blistering pace of growth that was happening across the Atlantic.
It's like the world was shifting, and they just couldn't quite keep up.
And that really highlights the main point of this whole paper. The rise of Europe wasn't just this one simple thing. It was a super complex mix of geography, institutions, and all sorts of historical quirks.
It was different for everyone, wasn't it? Some adapted better than others.
Exactly. It was a process of divergence, with winners and losers emerging as the world changed around them.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. It's amazing how these abstract ideas about institutions can have such real-world impacts.
It's like we've been looking at the gears and levers that make history tick.
We've seen how trade can reshape the balance of power, create new opportunities, and even leave some behind. And we've learned that institutions really do matter.
They're the foundation of everything. They shape incentives, drive economic activity, and influence how the benefits of growth are shared.
As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, understanding these dynamics is more important than ever.
Absolutely. The lessons we can learn from the rise of Europe, both the good and the bad, are crucial for navigating our own times.
Well said. To everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a fresh perspective on this fascinating period. It's a story full of twists and turns, and its legacy continues to shape our world today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.